everyone, Mike here, aka North Established, and welcome back to another video. And in this video, I'm going to be going over some camera basics that will get you started in photography. So in this video, I'm going to be covering the triangle of exposures, that which is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now, I'm going to try to keep this sweet, easy, and straight to the point, but no promises. It can be difficult to take really good pictures without having a solid understanding of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And I want you guys to really succeed as photographers, so it's really important that you understand the fundamentals. Now, while most new DSLRs have auto modes that help pick the right shutter speed, aperture, and ISO for your exposure, using auto mode can put limits to what you can actually achieve with your camera. You see, in many cases, the camera has to literally guess on what the right exposure should be by evaluating the light that passes through the lens into the camera sensor. Now, having a thorough understanding of how ISO, aperture, and shutter speeds works together will fully give the photographer full control of the situation by manually controlling the camera settings. Knowing how to adjust the settings on your camera when needed helps to get the best out of your camera and push it to its limits to create great photographs. Alright, so our first exposure, we're going to be talking about shutter speed. Alright, shutter speed. Let's define what shutter speed is first. Shutter speed is the length of time a shutter is open to expose light into the camera sensor. Now, shutter speeds are typically measured in fractions of a second. Slower shutter speeds are used to capture low light or night photography, while a faster shutter speed will help freeze motion. Now, example of shutter speeds are 1/15th of a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/90th of a second, 1/25th of a second, so on, so forth. You get it. Now, shutter speeds can control so much aspects of photography. Let's take our first example, for instance. Now, this is what we call a long exposure shot. Now, long exposure is when your shutter is being left open for a longer period of time than if you would have your shutter open faster for less time. See, what you're doing is you're allowing to have a slower shutter speed so you can allow more light into the camera, causing these long exposure shots. Typically, your shutter speed will be slower than 1/60th of a second, whereas if you had a higher shutter speed, you'll mostly get everything in focus. But wait, if shutter speed is calculated on how fast or slow shutter speed is capturing light into the camera sensor, how is it capturing those long exposure photography shots? Great question. Let's talk about aperture. Now, aperture is the iris in the lens which light travels into the camera body. So, for example, the larger the iris, the more light travels into the lens. The smaller the iris, less light travels through it. Now, aperture also controls the depth of field, which is the portion of a scene that appears to be sharp. If the aperture is very small, the depth of field is large. While if the aperture is large, the depth of field is very small. In photography, aperture is expressed in F numbers, also known as f-stops, focal ratios, and all these are measured in numbers. Now, example of these numbers are f1.2, f1.8, f2.8, f5.0, f8.0. It just keeps going on and on. Now, compared to a camera lens, the human pupil can rest at 4 millimeters in diameter. So in extreme dark, it dilates to approximately 8 millimeters, that could be equivalent to f2.1, whereas if it was in bright light, it contracts to approximately 2 millimeters at f8.3. Wait. Hold on, Mike. Slow down. How does that relate to shutter speed? I'm glad you asked. Remember when I was talking about long exposure photography, where the shutter has to be open for a longer period of time to get those light trails? Let's go back to our example. You see, your shutter needs the aperture, or rather the iris of the lens needs to close up more for you to get a shot like this. Because since your shutter is already letting much light in when having a slower shutter speed, your aperture has to subtract, or rather create a balance of light so your image won't look overexposed. So aperture basically acts as an anchor in this aspect. So you would typically have your aperture somewhere between f8 to f13, right? Right, exactly. Okay, so where does ISO play into all of this? ISO is just a way to brighten your image if you can't use a wider aperture or a longer shutter speed. It's typically measured in numbers, whereas a lower ISO is a darker image, while a higher ISO will bring out a more brighter image. So basically, the camera, not the outside world, but the camera body itself is creating this quote-unquote fake light to help brighten your image. However, raising your ISO can come at a cost. You see, as your ISO rises, so does the visibility of graininess or noise will begin to show in your images. So example of these ISO numbers are ISO 100, ISO 200, 400, 600, 800, so on, so forth. But one of the most well-known photographer tips for beginners is that you want to shoot your ISO as low as possible. That would be ISO 100. So the lower your ISO is, the more sharper your image will become. The higher ISO, the more you're beginning to welcome of the noise and graininess that I mentioned earlier. Now, most cameras have auto ISO, also known as ISO sensitivity, where the camera literally guesses of what the right exposure should be. ISO is basically served as the plate that holds together aperture and shutter speed. So for me, when I'm going out shooting, if I'm shooting through the daylight, I would either keep my ISO as low as possible, that which would be ISO 100, maybe ISO 200 depending on situation, but mostly ISO 100, I'll keep it as low as that. If it's at nighttime, I would still try to keep that ISO as low as possible. I'll just have more of a wider aperture. So just remember, the lower the f-stop, the more the lens is allowing more light into the camera sensor. Shutter speed, I'll keep at around 1/100 to 1/300 for the second, depending on the weather situations. Because when it's foggy out here in New York City, my images can sometimes look a little bit overexposed. So I would either just bump up my shutter to 1/500 of a second to 1/1000 of a second. But when push comes to shove, you can also adjust your white balance, which I will cover in a future camera basics video. Make sure you stay subscribed for that. And for aperture, it depends on the type of pictures that I want to take. Now, if you're doing architectural photography or even landscape photography for that matter, you will want to have a higher f number. So basically, typically you will have your f-stop at f8.0 or f16 around there. However, if you want to do portrait photography or take pictures of strangers and you want to have that nice creamy background bokeh behind you, you would technically want to have your aperture at around the lowest possible. So at f-stop of 1.8 or 1.2, 1.4, depending how low your lens can go. So since you interrupted my video 3 times, do you mind doing the outro for me? Yeah, sure. So guys, I hope you guys have gotten value in this video. If you have gotten value in this video, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe if you're new. He makes new videos every single week. I just edit them. But as always guys, just remember to just be yourself and just create. Peace. That was good. That was really good. Yeah, that was really good. Yeah. Just next time, buddy, don't ever interrupt me doing a video again, okay? Have fun editing this one. Alright? Peace.